Warning: the following audio dramatization contains special effects that may be unpleasant to hear at high volume. Please adjust your volume accordingly. Act 2, Scene 1. The door swung open to bump against the wall inside. Fluttershy leaned forward into the darkness and looked around. The room was indeed dark, but light from the outside helped illuminate and highlight many of the room's features. The center of the room was taken up by a massive, stationary, one-cylinder, single-acting diesel engine generator, which was cordoned off by a small metal fence with gaps on each side to allow for maintenance. The whole piece of machinery was stained a sickly, dirty brown with rust and shrouded under a layer of cobwebs. She eyed it before turning to look outside at the station lights. She turned away, suppressing the panic welling within to look back into the room. To her left were stacked numerous barrels, too high, that reeked of diesel. To her right lay a small work desk with 3 drawers and a small 2-layer shelf that held not books, but paperwork in old folders. Behind the engine, on the left side, she could make out what looked like a row of 3 lockers and a bench. Opposite this was a set of stairs that led up to a catwalk, which in turn ran along the edge of the room and out over the generator. Over by the far end of the catwalk, the section that ran along the wall, was a door with a sign on it. There were 4 ceiling lights, and all 4 of them were smashed. Curiously, Fluttershy walked over to the desk and chair to see what the paperwork said. She stepped around a candle holder which lay on the floor next to the desk, the candle long since melted into a hard, glossy puddle all over the floor. The papers on the desk were nothing more than a maintenance schedule for the engine. Its sole purpose was to power the electric lights. On the left side of the desk sat a folder labeled Accident Reports, and opening it up, she saw that it was full of notes ranging from ponies getting small cuts from broken glass to getting hit by kitchenware, and even the death of those twins she'd read about in the paper. At the very back was a newspaper clipping. There was no picture or headline. Some pony had just cut out the story. A sorrowful day today, as the building of the new train station was marred by the tragic death of the gallant laborer, Pickin' Shovel. While digging out the foundation of the station's bathroom, Mr. Shovel accidentally broke through the roof of an underground cave system and plummeted to his untimely death into the caverns below. It was all so sudden, one co-worker was quoted saying. One minute he was just digging, the next thing he was just... In all my life, I've never heard such a scream. Volunteers have been searching the caverns below for Mr. Shovel's body, but have yet to find it. Our hopes and prayers go out to the family he has left behind. There were indentations showing through from the other side of the clipping, and turning it over, she saw that some pony had scrawled on the back, "They never did find the body." Fluttershy put the clipping down and closed the folder. Looking over to the right side of the desk, she saw a small inbox with more paperwork stacked within. Sitting atop it all was what appeared to be a hoof-written letter. She picked it up and read it. Dear Ratchet Gear, it is with no shame in my heart that I write to you this letter of resignation. Too many bizarre, unexplainable events have been occurring around here, and I need to get out of here before they get me. Just like they got Hickory. I don't care what you say, and you can curse my name to the pits of Tartarus. I've been running this night shift longer than any pony else, and I'm scared out of my mind. There is something seriously wrong with this building, from the foundations to the very rooftop. I cannot stay here any longer, and if you're a smart pony, you won't either. Regards, Sprocket Wheel, Chief Engineer, Night Shift. Under the letter was an open envelope. The letter had not even been folded to fit it. Fluttershy immediately left the table to wander over to the lockers, thinking there might be something useful in there. The first locker was rusted shut, but the second locker opened to reveal diddly squat. Opening the third door, she was rewarded with a treasure trove of items. It appeared to belong to a repair pony, for there were numerous tools neatly placed in pouches that hung inside the locker. On closer inspection, many appeared to be missing. However, there were still nails, screws, a rolled-up tape measure, a matchbook, a claw hammer, an oil lantern, a ruler, and even a set square lay pushed away in the back. Fluttershy looked at the oil lantern. Looking around at the dark areas inside the room, she decided this would be mighty handy considering the lights inside weren't on. She leaned inside and carefully picked it up with her mouth. Opening up the tiny glass door, she frowned around the brass handle as she saw there was no oil within. With the lantern handle firmly secured between her teeth, Fluttershy looked off to her right. If there were an oil lamp, then surely there would be oil in here somewhere. There was a workbench hidden in the darkness. There were objects scattered all across the tabletop, but she wasn't able to make them out. However, she was able to identify one object nestled up against the side of the table, an oil can. She trotted over to it and, putting down the lantern, lifted up the can. To her relief, it was heavy with oil. She was careful to remove the cap and pour the oil into the lantern before heading back over to the locker to fetch the matches. They were old and broke easily as she snapped them off. Finally, she got one and managed to light it, thus lighting up the oil lantern. Closing the door, she picked it up with her mouth and shone it around the back area of the generator room. The bench that had been cloaked in darkness was revealed to show machine parts and pieces of plumbing pipes strewn all over it. Walking over, she noticed a dust-covered clipboard hanging down beside the bench. Putting down the lantern and picking up the clipboard, she blew the dust off in a great cloud before angling it so that the information could be legible in the light. The name at the top read H. Doc, Maintenance Engineer. The sheets were a checklist of problems that were obviously in need of repair. There were the usual: lights, electrical cords, track switches. Proceeding down the list, there was a tick next to each problem, followed by a comment by Mr. Doc. The first one was labeled Bar Room, suspected lights to be faulty. Mr. Doc had ticked it off as completed, and in the comments section wrote, "Suspect you are right." A muffled giggle escaped Fluttershy's closed lips. The rest of the comments were professional, but there was still the occasional smart aleck response as he repaired problem after problem. When she neared the bottom, the ticking and comments stopped right at the problem marked Bathroom Pipes, Possible Leakage, Constant Dripping Noise Heard. She put the checklist back on its hook and, retrieving the lantern, moved away from the bench. She was now behind the massive engine, its rusting, hulking, iron form looming over her like a mountain, engulfing her within its dark shadow. From behind, and in the dark, it looked foreboding. Fluttershy found herself staring at it a lot longer than she should have. She tilted her head slightly. There appeared to be some kind of growth attached to the back of the machine, but in the darkness she could not make out any details whatsoever. She hoisted the lantern up to bathe it in the light, but the instant she did, the growth disappeared. Fluttershy just gasped, almost dropping the lantern. Experimentally, she turned the lantern away and placed a hoof over it to block out the light. The instant she did, the growth reappeared. Only this time, it appeared to be in a different position. She quickly removed her hoof and, bringing back the light, banished the darkness once more. The growth was gone again. Cowering a little as she bent down to retrieve the lantern, she walked on, moving out into the more lit areas of the room. Darkness in this room was definitely not a place to linger long within. Ahead of her were the stairs that led up to the catwalk. Fluttershy followed it with her gaze, the lantern lighting the way. It ran along the upper back wall of the room before branching out to encompass the engine generator from above. She raised an eyebrow at the realization that it was for ponies to maintain and inspect the top section of the engine. Maybe no Pegasi worked here, or it was constructed for the Earth and unicorn ponies. Near the top of the stairs was an exit. She climbed up the steps and walked over to the door, placing a hoof to it, and pushed. It opened with an eerie creak. Inside, the lantern revealed a narrow corridor that led down to a door that was situated on her left. On the right side of the corridor were windows showing only dust. Curiously, she wiped her hoof across one of them and peeked out through it. All she saw was the forest outside and the blackness beyond. She turned back and carefully walked down the hall. Reaching the door at the other end, she pushed it open. The room inside was dark, with too many shadows and unrecognizable black objects. She hoisted the lantern and shone it into the darkness. It was a bar room. She remembered seeing those stairs on the outside leading up to a sign with a cider glass on it. Looking in from the door, she was in the far upper corner of the room. To her right, which was the wall the door opened onto, was a wall with windows along it and a door at its center. To her left, at the very back, was a bar with various bottles containing Celestia only knew what on the 2 shelves. Beneath those were 4 wooden barrels with taps. The bar counter itself was of rotting, black wood, which ran across, not too far from the back wall of the room, with a break on the right side, the bar counter door in an upright position. The whole layout and construction gave Fluttershy the impression that this room had only been set up as an afterthought. As with the cafe counter, an ancient till sat on the far end of the bench, rusted with time. Numerous square stools were situated along its length, waiting patiently for a customer. The rest of the room was bare. Much like the cafe in the next building across, tables and stools were stacked up against the opposite end of the room, near the windows on either side of the door. To her immediate left stood an ancient gramophone on a small cabinet. From the ceiling above hung 4 light bulbs, now black with age, while circling the room on the walls wherever there weren't any windows, doors, or shelves, were numerous paintings. Below one of the paintings, a landscape, a tarp had puddled on the floor beside a can with no label. Directly opposite Fluttershy was a very familiar set of double swing doors. She rounded the bar counter and peered down the back section, but there was nothing back here except for what she'd seen from the door. Barrels, shelves, and bottles, all covered in dust. The underside of the counter did have sliding doors. She wandered down and peered into them. Glasses, bowls, empty bottles, and even a bucket. She looked up from the bar to survey the rest of the room. Her eyes fell upon the paintings that lined the walls. They were mostly portraits with a few landscapes. Those were also very pretty. They depicted ponies frolicking and playing in parks, the beach, and even gardens. The ponies looked like they were having a great time. Their fun was artistically captured for all eternity in the paint on the canvas. It was then that Fluttershy could feel the fur on the back of her neck standing on end. Her whole body seized up as she scanned the room. She was not alone. She observed the left side of the room. The door to the generator room still hung open. Her eyes moved to the center of the room, with the exit door directly opposite her. She looked right, towards the other wall, and the swing door. Only the 2 grime-covered windows stared back at her like unwavering eyes. Slowly, her gaze slid back the other way. She could not quite put her hoof on it, but the room somehow seemed different. Her eyes came to a stop at one of the landscapes, putting the lantern down so she could get a better look at it. It was the one with the tarp and can beneath it. 4 ponies were in a park. A stallion and mare took up the lower left corner of the painting, affectionately nuzzling each other as they sat atop a red and white checkered picnic blanket. Their basket was overflowing with delicious-looking vegetables and hay. Their 2 children were in the center, playing a game involving a ball with their dog, who was poised in mid-jump. Behind them lay the rest of the park. Its neatly trimmed grass was a healthy shade of green that was interrupted by a crystal blue river that sparkled under Celestia's sun. A wooden bridge painted a light shade of red spanned the river towards the forest in the background. Fluttershy's expression grew more intense. She moved closer towards the painting. In the background, at the edge of the forest, stood a blurry figure. It was pony-shaped and stood on all fours, staring stoically off to the right at something the viewer couldn't see. Fluttershy blinked in confusion. That had not been there before. She turned to look at the other landscapes. Painting after painting revealed that they were still the same. She turned back to the new figure in the painting. It was still there. She scratched her mane in bafflement. She looked down at the tarp that had collected on the floor and the can beside it. Curiously, she lifted the lid and sniffed at it. The overpowering smell of turpentine greeted her. She whinnied as she snorted loudly, trying to rid her nostrils of the acrid stench. After a few more snorts, her nasal passages were cleared. Why would some pony leave a can of turpentine near a painting? Then realization struck her like a thunderbolt. Her eyes grew wide with panic as she eyed the tarp. It was just the right size to completely cover the painting. Her gaze shot back to the figure in the background. It was looking at her. Fluttershy went rigid. It had moved. "Get out of here," the little voice in the back of her mind started whispering. She slowly bent down, never taking her eyes off the painting to retrieve her lantern. Then she rose up and started backing away. She then paused. An idea was starting to prance through her mind and smiled. It was just a painting. She moved forward, keeping her eyes locked on the figure as she once again put down the lantern and gripped the tarp with both hooves. She lifted it off the ground and, unfolding it, threw it over the painting before hooking it around the edges, covering it from view. She stepped back to admire her handiwork and nearly knocked over the can of turpentine. Grunting, she moved it aside, moving it beneath the landscape painting next to her, before turning back to the other one. All she could see now was the dull, gray tarp, the outline of the painting lining its edges. Her smile turned triumphant. She may not be brave, but she was smart. She turned back to the rest of the bar room. There didn't appear to be anything in the room that she could use for defense. Well, she had the lantern, but that would only work against dark rooms, not ghosts. She turned to the swing doors. They led back to the cafe in the other building, back to those giggling fillies. Did she want to take the chance of going back there? The final image she'd seen of them briefly flickered in her mind, and she had some difficulty swallowing the lump forming in her throat. However, there could be something useful in that kitchen. Her whole body shivered violently at the memory of her last trip there, and she turned back to the bar counter. There hadn't been anything there, so she turned back to the swing door. Her gaze snapped back to the tarp-covered painting. The tarp was back on the floor, exposing the landscape to her gaze once more. Again, she found herself saddled with a lack of movement. How? That was the first thought that bellowed within her mind. She had not even heard the tarp slip off, let alone hit the ground. However, all coherent thoughts immediately derailed at seeing the painting. The figure was closer. It now stood on the opposite side of the river, right behind the two foals playing with their dog. Now that it was closer, Fluttershy could see it more clearly. Its face was obscured by a featureless, white, porcelain doll's mask. It wore a neat three-piece suit with a black dinner jacket, white undershirt and black bow tie, and the top of its head was crowned by a black top hat. It was staring straight at her. Without even uttering one squeak, Fluttershy grabbed the top of the painting and wrenched it off the wall, slamming it face down on the floor. She then gripped one corner with her mouth and dragged it towards the door that exited to the outside. This abomination was going into the forest. She placed it down and tested the handle. The door opened. She pushed it all the way and looked out at the forest. It wasn't too far a trip if she flew. Turning back, she trotted back inside. The painting was the right way up again. Now the pony was directly in the foreground, dead center between the fillies and the couple. It could have been her overactive imagination running wild, but the emotionless mask looked furious. She galloped over and, rearing up, slammed the painting face down hard. She then stomped her left hoof on it, pinning it there as she bent down and, taking her hoof off the painting, picked it up with her mouth and carried it outside. Beating her wings, she lifted herself up and gently glided over the forest. Her jaws parted, and she watched with satisfaction as the painting plummeted into the dead trees below. She listened to the receding sounds as it crashed and banged until, with a dull thump, the night air was once more quiet. She sighed with relief as she circled around and landed at the top of the stairs. Walking inside, she closed the door behind her before turning her gaze to the rest of the paintings. None of them had changed. She walked up to the nearest landscape and scrutinized its background. No masked pony in a suit could be seen. She trotted over to the next. Again, empty. She walked over to the last and froze. Behind her, the door was open. Leaning against the doorframe was the painting, back from the forest. It even still had some vines attached to it. Fluttershy's entire body went stiff as her wings locked up. This wasn't possible. This wasn't fair. The painting kept coming back no matter what she did. What could she possibly hope to do against something like that? It was then that she saw it. Her fear melted away like butter in a hot summer's afternoon. Never taking her eyes off the painting, she slowly moved forward towards it and then stopped altogether. The masked pony was gone. She looked in the foreground, the background, even turning the painting around and flipping it back again. Nothing. She picked it up and, holding it upside down, shook it. Still nothing. Experimentally, she trotted outside and heaved it over the railing, watching as it crashed to the ground below. She stared at it, closed her eyes, and then opened them again. The painting was still there. She scratched her mane in confusion, then shrugged, turned about, and walked back inside. Then she froze halfway across the threshold. There stood something within the shadows over by the old gramophone. It stared back at her with black, empty eye holes. It stood still like a statue, not even so much as breathing. Fluttershy could not even move herself as her own breath caught in her throat. A loud vinyl scratch pierced the air like a knife all of a sudden, followed by the gentle pops and clicks of static. A pleasant sound began to fill the air. Fluttershy blinked the stupor away to realize that the gramophone was now playing. She had not even seen the needle move. Now the record spun round and round, causing the needle to bob up and down as the music played. She flicked an ear at the sounds coming from the brass tube. It was a relaxing, calming tune, like the sounds a small music box would make. The sounds were hypnotic. She felt her mind melting away into a sea of calm as her muscles relaxed. Yet she did not collapse. In spite of the sleep washing over her, she felt compelled to move. One hoof moved forward, followed by the other. She was inside the room without even realizing it. She wanted to stop, to know what was happening to her. The instant she did, she felt the urgency to understand just as quickly vanish. It didn't seem to matter anymore. She was standing before a painting now, another landscape. Ironically, it was the painting that had been next to the one she'd been trying to get rid of. This one was of some city street at night. A bar of sorts sat on the counter with glass windows on both sides, allowing the viewer to see not only the interior, but the street behind as well. There were ponies in the painting, all sitting at the bar counter. Her eyes went glassy. She wanted to join them, talk to them, drink with them. She reached out with her front hoof and touched the painting. Although her hoof went right through the canvas, she wasn't surprised. The entire painting rippled like the disturbed surface of a pond as her hoof sunk in deeper. She raised her other hoof to grasp a firm hold when she knocked something over with a metallic clang. Liquid spilled out onto the floor and across her hooves as the overwhelming smell of turpentine bombarded her senses. She cried out in disgust, stumbling back and shaking her head as the stench stung her sensitive nose. She snorted loudly several times before her passages were free of the horrid smell. Blinking a few times, she became aware of her surroundings. The first sight that greeted her was that of the landscape painting of the city bar. Only now it had changed. The city was destroyed. Its buildings in the background reduced to crumbling, charred husks. The streets were cracked and broken, with sections jutting up into the air. Tongues of flame licked out from within their depths, casting disturbing shadows of desperate hooves, reaching in vain for the surface from deep within. The bar itself was a ruin. The windows were smashed, while the ponies inside were horribly disfigured, their fur falling off, their skin rotting away to reveal muscles, eye sockets, exposed, grinning teeth, and bone beneath. Fluttershy screamed as she stumbled backwards, away from the grisly sight before her. Then her memory of previous events returned as a flash flood, and her gaze swung over to the gramophone. The masked pony now stood in front of the ancient device, staring at her. The neutrality of the mask's expression was gone, replaced with one of rage. Wrinkles now adorned the mask's brows and cheeks as its eye holes were narrowed to dangerous slits, and the mouth was twisted into a perfect, upside-down crescent moon shape. The music began to filter back into her ears all of a sudden, and she felt herself start to get hazy. No, she could not let herself be snagged again. The music. She had to stop the music, but how? She couldn't just run over and stop the machine. She was already finding it difficult to move, and she doubted she'd even make 2 steps towards it. Even now, she could feel her mind clouding over once more. What could she do? The spilled can still lay at her hooves. On the spur of the moment, she struck out hard with her front leg, kicking the can and sending it flying towards the gramophone. She missed. The can smacked against the side of the wooden cabinet and, glancing off, struck the masked pony in the face with a dull thwacking sound. There was a loud, warped screech, like some pony harshly dragging a needle along the length of a delicate record with little regard, and Fluttershy's ears flattened back against her head. The can clattered to the floor, and she could smell the turpentine. There must have been some still left in the can, for she could see a small trail trickling out to puddle on the floor. She looked up at the masked pony and shrieked with horror. Its face was ghastly, twisted, and melted, its mouth and eyeholes drooping as the whole face sank heavily to the left. The screeching sound was now a low, agonizing groan as it seemed to stagger from some unseen weight. Before she could even twitch, the creature abruptly exploded into a tornado of swirling, jet-black paint that twisted and somersaulted through the air before corkscrewing right into the painting Fluttershy had been about to climb into. Fluttershy stumbled backwards before looking back at the painting. Nothing. The horrible funhouse mirror image she'd seen as she was about to step into it was gone. There was nothing different about it from the first time she'd seen it. The masked pony was nowhere to be found. Still, just to be on the safe side, she picked up the can. There was still some turpentine left within. She was about to splash it on the painting when she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. No. This was wrong. This wasn't her. She lowered the can. Yes, this thing had tried to imprison her, but she wasn't going to resort to stooping to its level. She was Fluttershy, the element of kindness. This place was full of monsters, and there was no way in Tartarus that she was going to become one herself. She tilted her head slightly in deep thought. Still, just because she was kind did not mean she was stupid. She had to take some precaution against this thing should it decide to come back for round 2. Looking around, she spied the old tarp and picking it up, placed it over the painting, covering it up completely. She briefly wondered if she should not bother trying that. This hadn't worked the last time. However, she had wounded it, forcing it to retreat. Licking her lips, she decided to conduct a little test. She turned her back and closed her eyes before opening them and spinning around, the can held ready just in case. The tarp was still there. She shrugged. Maybe it was too weak from the turpentine for round 2. She rubbed a hoof to her chin before looking around at the rest of the paintings in the room. What if it could move between them? There wasn't enough cloth or tarps in the room to cover all of them. Maybe she could take them down and turn them around the other way? No, that would take too long. Whatever the answer, it wouldn't be prudent to linger here any longer. She stood back and once again surveyed the room. There was nothing else in here. She eyed the tarp-covered painting. She didn't want to be in the room 1 second more, but where could she now go? She swung her gaze over to the set of double swing doors. That way led to the cafe and the twins. She involuntarily shivered. She looked back to the door that would return her to the generator room. She tilted her head slightly and thought. Maybe there was something else back there that she missed. Something she overlooked? Anything to get out of this creepy room. After picking up the lantern, she trotted back and pushed open the door to the corridor. The inside seemed somewhat darker than before. She looked out the windows and, just like the last time, saw only the forest outside. She looked down the hall towards the door, open and inviting her back into the generator room. She hesitated a little. Something was not right. Slowly, she tiptoed down the hall towards the door at the far end. Each and every hoofstep caused the floorboards beneath to creak and groan. As she neared the door to the generator room, she paused. She strained her ears, listening to the sounds of the night. Her left ear flicked. There it was again, a sniffing sound. Her eyes narrowed as she carefully put down the lantern, lowered the light intensity to a dull flicker before pushing it behind her. She did not want the light to attract whatever was making that noise. Once finished, she stared ahead of her at the open door. All she could see was the top of the stairs. The sounds came again, much more audible than before, followed by the clatter of cans being knocked over. Then, like distant thunder, a low, rumbling growl echoed up from the room below. Fluttershy's bottom jaw twitched with trepidation. Something metallic crashed onto the floor, ringing loudly throughout the building. The renewed growling reverberated through the narrow corridor, almost causing it to vibrate. Fluttershy took an uneasy step backwards, almost kicking over the lantern. Through the door, she could not make out anything, as all light in the room was gone, leaving no shadows to cast. All she could make out were the various outlines of the catwalk, which shook to the sounds of something stomping, intertwined with heavy claws raking on the cement floor. Something large. The sounds grew closer as the shaking grew more intense. They paused at the bottom of the stairs, plunging the entire night into an eerie calm. Fluttershy held her breath, and her wings started twitching nervously. She tried to sink her head back into her mane, and she felt a bead of sweat trickle down the side of her face to land with a loud plop on the floor. It might well have been a cannon shot. An intense sniffing resounded from the generator room. There was a heavy footfall, followed by another and another. Ahead through the door, Fluttershy could see the catwalk beyond, trembling. Another heavy step. Another. The railings were jumping wildly from something. Something heavy was climbing up the steps. Towards her. A shrill scream shattered the night air, and it took only a few seconds to realize that it was her own. She jumped into the air, wings snapping out, and she flew down the rest of the corridor towards the open door. Reaching it, she did not wait a second longer. Grabbing the door, she slammed it shut with an almighty bang and reached down to secure the lock. Only there was none. It needed a key. Terror froze her entire body, causing her wings to lock up, and she fell back to the floor with a thud. The sounds were at the top of the stairs now. Looking up at the wooden door before her, Fluttershy did the only thing she could think of. She threw her weight against the door and dug her hind legs into the floorboards, determined to hold her ground. Then she listened. The air was silent. The noises had ceased. Carefully, she placed an ear to the door. Something scraped on the opposite side, and she jerked her head back. There was a low, insidious growl before something slammed against the door, hard. The whole frame buckled from the impact, and Fluttershy screamed again, pressing her back up against the door even harder, praying that it would hold. Again the door was struck, jarring the whole frame, bending it under the pressure. She clenched her teeth so hard she feared that they would break. A frustrated growl slid through the cracks of the door before it was hit hard all of a sudden, breaking it right at the middle. Fluttershy was sent flying backwards from the impact, her scream echoing loudly up and down the corridor. She hit the side of the walls and bounced painfully off before landing in a tangled heap on the floor. She winced in pain as she opened her eyes to the sight of a bright, white light. The lantern. She shut her eyes again as the light stung them, but quickly pushed it to the background as she shakily rose to all four hooves and turned towards the now shattered door, ready to face her new tormentor. There was only an empty doorframe. Fluttershy's face scrunched up in confusion. She blinked a few more times, but the same empty sight was still present before her. Fluttershy stood as still as she could on her trembling legs, listening. But there was only silence. Her muzzle wrinkled with confusion. What in the name of Celestia had just happened? She strained to see the generator room beyond the doorframe, but all she could see from the light cast by the lantern was the walls of the catwalk and a few shattered ceiling lamps. She paused, her eyes floating back down to the lantern. Or rather, the dull, flickering light she reduced the flame to without having to turn it off completely. Her mind traveled back to when she'd been behind the generator, and she'd seen that obstruction in the shadows that had vanished the instant she flashed the lantern on it, only to return once she'd covered the light. Whatever that thing was, it could not exist in the light. Without taking her eyes off the doorway, She increased the brightness of the lantern before reaching to grip the handle with her teeth. Carefully, she took a step backwards. Another, then another. She was halfway down the corridor before it even registered. Quietly, she turned around and exited back into the bar room, closing the door to the corridor behind her. She muttered with frustration around the lantern handle upon finding no lock. Fluttershy quickly glanced over at the landscape painting, which, thanks Celestia, was still covered with its tarp. Another quick survey revealed no mysterious masked ponies in any other paintings. Still, she didn't stay in this room any longer. She moved the lantern so that it illuminated the swing doors which led back to the cafe. She still hadn't found anything useful in this building, and she did not want to spend another second in it. Those fillies haunted the other building. Could she risk running into them again? She cautiously walked over to the swing doors and, angling the lantern, shone it through their round windows. The hallway on the other side was empty. She could see the windows lining both sides of the hallway and the double swing doors at the other end, but that was all. Experimentally, she pushed open one of the doors and stuck her head into the hallway. Shining the lantern this way and that revealed exactly what she'd seen from the window. A loud, bellowing roar shattered the quiet. Fluttershy spun around, facing the wall at the opposite end of the room. With horror, she understood that it had come from the door that led back to the generator room. What remained of the destroyed door was shattered as a loud, rhythmic thumping began to work its way down the corridor. She could see the walls shaking from the excessive pounding as something very large crashed and banged towards the still open door that exited into the bar room. The very bar room she was inside. Panic seized her mind as she watched with wide eyes the open door, now swinging on its hinges from the vibrations that were shaking the whole room. That thing was back, and it was coming for her. Instinct took over as she swung the lantern and aimed it straight at the open door. Just as before, the crashing and banging stopped. Fluttershy smiled around the handle in her mouth. A sharp gust of wind flowed past her from behind, ruffling her whole body, causing her to shiver from the chill air as it enveloped her whole body like a breeze straight out of the icy north. Without warning, the light within the lantern suddenly flickered out, plunging the whole room into darkness. Fluttershy's whole body stiffened with fear. How had that happened? The glass door was closed. She dropped the lantern, frantically opening the door and attempting to get the light back on. The roar of triumph that followed rocked Fluttershy to her core. She turned her head towards the open door as the lumbering sound lurched forwards, causing the whole doorframe to shiver as her own body. Panic gripped her. She could not even move as she stood there, half crouched over the lantern, eyes locked on the ever-shaking doorframe as the growling and snarling grew louder. The hallway behind it began to grow darker, as if it were being swallowed up by the nothingness in the sky above. A low, guttural sound emitted from just beyond the doorway that caused the whole room to vibrate, rattling the lantern before heavy footfalls started forward. That seemed to wake her up from her frozen stupor. Not even uttering a sound, she spun and flung the double doors wide open before pounding down the hallway towards the identical set situated at the opposite end. Then she came to a sudden halt as she realized that she'd forgotten the lantern. However, all that was shelved in favor of another realization. The air was silent once again. There were no crashing sounds, no hideous roaring, no shaking walls. There was nothing. Standing halfway down the hallway, she listened, rewarded with no other sounds save her rapid and frightened breathing. It was as if it never existed at all. Fluttershy stopped right there as her eyes went wide with the comprehension of that last thought. Like a whisper, a faint tide of wind flowed up the hallway to ruffle the back of her mane. Behind her, she heard the swing door gently close shut, and like a switch, the soft wind was no more. For the fleetest of moments, Fluttershy could not find the means with which to breathe as she stood there in the middle of the dark corridor. Slowly, very slowly, her head turned. A shadow moved among shadows. In the dim light, Fluttershy could make out the silhouette of a small pony, a foal, now standing motionless before the door behind her.
"Welcome back,"
echoed a filly's voice in the darkness.
"We have missed you."